Hello and welcome to Road to Westminster 2015. I'm Roshan Mohammed Salih. Today we're going to focus on British foreign policy and how that's affecting the UK general election. We'll also be asking how it'll affect the rest of the world once a new government is formed. Although Britain has slowly withdrawn its troops from disastrous campaigns in Iraq and Afghanistan, David Cameron's government of the last 5 years has still presided over what many would consider to be an aggressive foreign policy. There was the military intervention in Libya, which is now in a state of anarchy. There was the support for the overthrow of Bashar al-Assad in Syria, which is also now in a state of war. Then there's the constant backing of Saudi Arabia and Israel and the hawkish stance towards Iran and Russia. But with domestic politics dominating the election campaign, what role will foreign policy play in voters' minds? And can any of the smaller parties play a restraining role on the major ones if they enter into a coalition government with Labour or the Conservatives? We'll be thrashing those issues out today, but first here's a report from Faiza Ahmed.
Over the last 5 years of Arab revolutions and uprisings, British foreign policy has been described by some as muddled at best and downright disastrous at worst. The failed intervention in Libya, which is now in a state of anarchy, has been labelled as David Cameron's biggest foreign policy disaster. But will he now be looking back with irony when he promised Libyans their freedom in 2011?
With the elections around the corner, it's just not the coalition government's Middle Eastern adventures that are coming under scrutiny. Its entire foreign policy is being attacked from all sides, with many claiming the current government has made Britain irrelevant on the world stage.
Despite this criticism, party leaders seem to have sidestepped foreign policy during their campaigns. The Liberal Democrats' manifesto launch was no exception, with party leader and Deputy Prime Minister Nick Clegg choosing to focus more on domestic issues. The Liberal Democrats made many foreign policy pledges in 2010 before they joined the coalition government as junior members, but how many have actually been met?
What we've made sure is that any international action has support of the United Nations. That didn't happen under Tony Blair. For example, with the war in Iraq, there was no second United Nations Security Council resolution, for example, and Liberal Democrats opposed the Iraq war because of that. We've made sure that this government has stuck to international law. That's absolutely critical. On defence spending, we do believe we need to maintain strong forces. We need to be part of NATO. We need to be part of the European Union, which is vital for our security. We don't believe we need to replace Trident, which is a sort of Cold War weapon system, but we do believe Britain needs to retain a nuclear deterrent.
The current foreign policy hot potato is Yemen, where a complicated local conflict has descended into an all-out war after Saudi military intervention. Although Britain is not directly taking part, Foreign Secretary Philip Hammond has pledged Britain's diplomatic, logistical and technical support for the Saudi bombing campaign. At a demonstration held against the Saudi intervention in Yemen, mixed views were expressed as to how important foreign policy was in voters' minds in light of recent events.
The ex-government Labour and the current government has failed to be really fair and to prevent their warplanes attacking civilian people in Yemen. So that's why we are going not to vote this year again.
With Blair, I feel like you could have voted for him and not anticipated what would happen and disagree with his decision to go to war, where 1 million people protested against it, yet he did nothing. So I feel like when you vote, you really have no power with your vote over foreign policy.
But with the likelihood of another coalition government being very high, could the smaller parties who might enter into a partnership with the major ones restrain their foreign policy excesses?
They can't control foreign policy, but they can, as we've seen with the SNP in the case of Trident, and perhaps on other votes, make a big difference because they basically have it within their power to make the government fall.
David Cameron's government has been accused of presiding over a hawkish policy for the last 5 years. As a result, all eyes will be on the next government to see if it will radically change UK's role on the world stage. Faiza Ahmed, Road to Westminster.
To discuss British election and foreign policy, we have two guests in the studio with us today. Andre Walker is the UK political correspondent for the Breitbart news network and has worked as a press officer and political aide for the Conservatives at the London Assembly. And Dan Glazebrook is a political writer and journalist. He writes on international relations and the use of state violence. He's also the author of Divide and Ruin, the West's Imperial Strategy in an Age of Crisis. Welcome, guys, both of you to the show. Dan, I'm going to start with you. So if you're someone who has the welfare of the Middle East, especially in your heart, who would you vote for in the upcoming elections?
Well, I think the main kind of slogan for anyone who does have the welfare of the Middle East or Africa, or indeed humanity as a whole, in their heart, the slogan should be boycott the war parties. So I definitely wouldn't advocate voting for Labour or the Conservatives or the Liberal Democrat, all of whom have been implicated and actually supported and launched wars of aggression.
So that leaves what, SNP and Greens?
Well, yeah, either of those.
Either
of those. I mean, I don't think we have in this country the kind of party that we actually need.
Yeah.
That's going to take the country forward in terms of social progress in this country and in terms of opposing imperialist foreign policy.
So for you, it's
abroad.
an anti-war vote. And Dan, I mean, if we look back at the last 5 years of David Cameron, I mean, I know that Tony Blair's got crucified over Iraq, hasn't he, by the media in general and the political establishment, whatever. Whereas David Cameron seems to have got off a bit lightly, hasn't he, with Libya? I mean, that's a complete mess, isn't it?
Absolutely. Well, David Cameron learnt the lesson of Iraq, which is if you're going to make war, if you're going to launch wars of aggression, then try and do it in such a way that body bags don't come home. He's successfully done this, and this is always continues to be trumpeted as a success. In the Conservative manifesto, Libya war is still painted as a success, despite the fact that it's destabilized the whole region, it's boosted Boko Haram, it's caused a devastating war in Mali, it's boosted the war in Syria, etc. It's led to the rise of ISIS in Libya, it's led to the disasters in the Mediterranean we've been seeing.
So kind of like indirect intervention rather than direct. Well, it was quite direct, wasn't it? I mean, they bombed the country, didn't they? Just didn't put troops on the ground. Andre, if I can come to you. So just kind of response to Dan and the last 5 years of Cameron, I mean...
Well, the first thing I've got to say, look, off foreign policy for 1 second, I know it's the first thing I'm going to say, but tax at nightmare levels, the NHS is failing. There's thousands of people just messing about on the dole. And what we really need is another left-wing political party. That's ridiculous. Actually, we don't need any more left-wing parties. We don't need any more socialists, including Labour, Lib Dems, or the left of the Conservative Party.
But anti-war party, anti-war party.
On the issue of anti-war, look, I think we are in a less interventionist age. I have to say, delighted with the Arab Spring. I thought it was going to turn into this great period of democracy and freedom, and we're going to sweep away all the old evil dictators. Well, some of the dictators are gone, but the result has not been exactly what we might have hoped. I think it's a depressing thought that we went in and intervened in countries and then they were incapable of building.
So Libya was a mistake? Well, and Syria was a mistake?
Well, hang on. I mean, removing Colonel Gaddafi wasn't a mistake. The mistake is that that we weren't able to get it together. I mean, I always say about Afghanistan, I think it's quite interesting because if you look back at the British Empire, there was no desire to impose a system on people. The Indian subcontinent would run in the way that it did always run, just under British control. If you look at Afghanistan, what was the ambition there? To kick the Taliban out and kill Al-Qaeda. They did that. And then suddenly we all started saying to ourselves, well, what we've got to do is nation build and build a democracy and put this lunatic Hamid Karzai in charge. And actually, that's when we failed. But it's this mission.
Andre, but you want a UKIP Conservative alliance, don't you? That's your preference.
No. I want a UKIP Conservative DUP alliance.
Well, should the people in the Middle East put the crash helmets on then? Are they going to get bombed again?
Well, no, I think quite the opposite, actually. I mean, if you think about it, from the point of view of the DUP have done a huge amount on stabilising Northern Ireland, as all the political parties in Northern Ireland have done. And UKIP is very against intervention. I mean, Nigel Farage's simple view is that, and I have a great deal of sympathy for this, as you might imagine, is that we have this whole idea of goodies and baddies. And I think it's an American State Department idea where you come in and you go, Bashir al-Assad is the baddie and the goodies are the rebels. Yeah, and then, of course, you realise the goodies are horrendous. Yeah. And Bashir al-Assad is as well.
We're going to move on for the moment. I will let you back in a few minutes' time, Dan. Our reporter, Faiza Ahmed, has been trying to break down where the major parties with a stake in this upcoming election stand in relation to the big foreign policy issues of the day. Here's what she came up with.
Foreign policy has hardly had a mention in the leaders' debates nor in the manifesto launches, but here are some of the key points. Now, when it comes to Palestine, all three parties share a similar pro-Israel view. Both the Conservatives and Labour parties support a two-state solution for Israel and Palestine.
The Liberal Democrats also support a two-state solution. However, they also believe Britain and the EU must put pressure on Israel and Egypt to end the blockade of Gaza. And finally, the Scottish Government has urged Westminster to recognise Palestine as an independent state. And Alex Salmond called for an arms embargo on Israel following the attack on Gaza. Moving on to Iran and its nuclear programme. The Conservatives back concerted international efforts to prevent Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon, leaving the military option on the table. Labour seeks diplomatic resolution of Iran's nuclear ambitions and will also rule out no options. The Liberal Democrats support diplomatic efforts to ensure Iran does not obtain nuclear weapons but oppose military action. Britain has launched several wars in the last 15 years, most notably in Afghanistan, Iraq and Libya. So when it comes to military intervention, the Conservatives support humanitarian military intervention when it is practical and necessary, and Labour believes in taking action when it is the right time to do so. However, they feel military interventions alone are not enough and lessons should be learnt from the past. The Liberal Democrats, on the other hand, support the right of nations to intervene if foreign governments engage in large-scale violations of human rights, but force should only be used as a last resort and be authorised by the UN Security Council in all but exceptional circumstances. However, the SNP have taken a different line and in 2010 launched a Scottish Centre for Reconciliation and Conflict Resolution to promote peaceful alternatives to armed conflict. Now, moving on to nuclear options, Labour and Conservatives favour replacing the Trident nuclear submarine fleet with a similar continuous at-sea nuclear deterrent. The Liberal Democrats say they would only replace some of Britain's 4 nuclear-armed submarines and they would not need to be on constant patrol. And of course, the SNP opposes nuclear weapons and are pushing for the removal of Trident submarines from Scotland.
Dan, I kind of rudely interrupted you before that report. You wanted to get a quick point in, I'll let you do that.
Yeah, I wanted to rudely interrupt Andre just to make the point that there was no great discontinuity between British policies in Afghanistan today and British policies in India, for example. The idea that Britain completely allowed India to run on the same basis.
Let me finish hang on a second.
The Mughal
local
Empire,
Maharajas continued,
I didn't interrupt
and local
you.
warlords
the Mughal Empire
should have been allowed to continue.
Had serious systems of famine relief, of irrigation, of draining, and
but
all of this was destroyed by the British.
I don't want to get
created famines in 2 centuries of rule than in the previous 2 millennia.
I don't want to get bogged down in history, so I've got to kind of reclaim control of this debate. Let's go on to ISIL. The Brits say that this is the new threat to the British mainland. We're hearing newspaper headlines all the time. That's why they're bombing Iraq and Syria, etc. What do you make of that, Dan? ISIL, the new threat.
Yeah, well, this is a threat that's been created by the West. This is a threat that's resulted from the wars in Libya, Iraq and Syria. That's clear. That's not really a controversial point. That's well understood that it was Colonel Gaddafi ran a serious regional anti-terrorism operation that was very effective, that was destroyed. Libya was turned into a safe haven for regional groups, Al-Qaeda, Boko Haram and ISIS. I mean, the main ally on the ground, the shock troops of NATO in the war in Libya was the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group led by Belhaj, who is now the leader of ISIS.
This
is not really
Andre, I mean,
basically
point. The conditions for ISIL and Al-Qaeda to thrive were created by Western invasions, right? That's true.
No, they were created here in the West. Because, you know, if you think of Mohammed Emwazi, we bring the family over, we give him a council house and a social security check, and then he goes off and joins the Islamic State.
He's a detail, right? He's a detail.
I think, no, but it's a key detail, isn't it? It's a key detail. And as far as I'm concerned, look, you know, it's like saying you wore a short skirt, you deserve to get raped. Look, I did not create the Islamic State.
Is it?
I did not create these evil beheading monsters. These people are...
I'm not saying you did, but I'm saying that David Cameron did, kind of, didn't he?
Well, look, I don't think...
There wasn't ISIL in Libya before 2011.
I'll tell you what I'm absolutely not going to do. I'm not going to sit here and take the blame for the Islamic State. Neither do I think the British have to take the blame for the Islamic State. I think the Islamic State needs to take the blame for themselves.
A little bit of self-reflection, surely.
But then other people need to, perhaps across the Islamic world, recognise that the way the Islamic world has been run for many years has created these toxic environments. I mean, look, you know, Britain bombed Libya, but Colonel Gaddafi had run the thing for a significant amount of time and caused many of the social
Andre,
problems.
I think most experts I've spoken to would disagree with that. You know, they would say that the Muslim world was doing fine before the West came along to bomb them, and these kind of the political instability that these invasions have created that's what's unleashed these forces of extremism. But I want to go back, I want to ask you another question about Saudi Arabia, Israel and the United States. And these are the countries that the UK is aligned to. Is that an unbreakable alliance? Is that going to continue forever?
I'm a Conservative. I support our alliance with Jordan, which is the traditional country in the region that Britain supported. Look, on the issue of Israel, I mean, I support two states, but I think the Israelis need to get a grip. They need to actually try and detoxify the situation. My family is Northern Irish, and my relatives and other people's relatives would end up fighting each other for decades and killing each other. It really didn't come to a great deal of resolution until people started to look a little bit differently.
Can I say something about
yes, quickly. I also want to get your reaction to kind of what Andre said about the Islamic world must share its blame for ISIL to a certain extent.
Well, where I'd agree with Andre about ISIS being created in the West, and I would disagree with yourself about people like Mohammed Emwazi being kind of marginal. It's estimated about 600 British Muslims gone over to fight with ISIS. And it came out in court last year, don't forget, that MI5 has been facilitating fighters from Britain to Syria. It came out in court in the hearing of Mozan Beg, where his defense was, this was approved, my training of fighters in Syria was approved by MI5, who met with me, gave the green light, and MI5 came out and admitted that was true. So, like I say, David Cameron's learnt the lessons. You can't send the British Army directly to fight these wars, but you can use your intelligence services to facilitate and create the conditions whereby people will go and volunteer to fight.
Look,
on the point about US, Saudi Arabia and Israel, I think we have to, these are the key allies, as you say, in the region for Britain. And what are the things that these powers have in common? There's two things, right? One is that they're all states that are founded on racist, genocidal massacres, right? That's one.
Really
the other thing is that they're all creations of the British Empire. Right, and so it's not a surprise that these are the regional powers.
I think you should move to the Islamic State. You hate Britain so much, you should probably leave.
You hate Britain, do you?
I don't hate Britain, I like Britain.
Loads it.
I love England.
You can be left wing and not hate Britain.
You love it in a sort of Ralph Miliband type of love.
Yeah, in the sense that I hate the financial and military class that run the British state.
You hate the financial and military success of Britain, and you like everything that we did badly.
But the point is, now Britain is imposing a policy on the Middle East that involves race.
In what way are we imposing a policy on the Middle East?
We can talk for a lot more. We have to move on because we've got a few
racist massacres. It's no surprise.
Racist massacres.
All right.
Let's get
the headlines on the video wall, please, because we have to move on because the show will be soon over. General election 2015. This is from The Independent. Alex Salmond, how he can swing independence in Scotland. A lot of talk now about the Scottish National Party will be the third biggest party in Parliament, around 40 seats. They could prop up a Labour government, perhaps blackmail a Labour government, some are saying, on their hot potato issues like Trident, getting rid of Trident. Is that a realistic possibility, Andre?
Well, I don't think 40 seats is a realistic possibility. You've got to bear in mind that the swing to get them that many would require all sorts of Glaswegian seats falling, which have huge Labour majorities. But I think 25, 30 is perfectly possible. I wrote on Breitbart, the website that I work for, that I think there should be a Conservative Labour coalition. And the reason why I say that is because if it's a choice between Cameron putting Miliband in power or Miliband and Salmon, he'd be better putting Miliband in power, and then all he would do is support him in confidence motions. I don't believe that's going to happen, but I think that's a national good.
Dan, can the SNP stop Labour wars or Conservative wars? Are they going to have that kind of clout to bring down a government?
Potentially, but really these kind of policies are really outside the remit of politicians, I think, largely. They're created in the kind of deep state of the military bureaucracy and intelligence services and so on, and presented almost as a fait accompli, I think, to politicians. That said, the SNP, they do have a different position on wars, they do have a different position on nuclear weapons, and if they stick to that, they could have some influence.
I would make one point.
Very quickly.
It's not necessarily against Dan or in favour of what he's saying. You've got to bear in mind one thing. The heartland of Labour loyalist territory in northern England would not countenance Britain ceasing to be a nuclear power. They wouldn't. It's not something that would have gone down.
Nuclear weapons are here to stay.
I think so.
Okay, let's go to a final headline. We've talked so much that we're going to miss out a couple of headlines. Why is every party in this election ignoring foreign policy? This is an article in The Telegraph. The author of this article argues that foreign policy is not an issue in this election. It should be, though, and Britain should be intervening more rather than less. More British intervention in the world. That's what the world needs, Dan.
Well, no, clearly not. Like we're seeing the results of the interventions with ISIS, as we've been talking about, the whole destabilization of Northern Africa and the Middle East. But the reason why all parties are ignoring it is because they are all implicated in creating the disasters that are there to be discussed. They've helped create the disaster in Ukraine, supporting a fascist death squad kind of coup, basically, last February. They're implicated in the
Putin's
destabilization
position on Ukraine?
What's that got to do with it?
You don't.
Does that justify supporting a coup?
Oh, come on. So you support the Russian dictator, Vladimir Putin, over the Ukrainian people to have their own country for them. I mean,
do you think anyone who's anti-Putin should be overthrown in a fascist coup?
Why is it that you really hate imperialism unless it's Putin?
Well,
answer the question. Why is it? Putin can take Ukraine, Crimea, but nobody else can. No, if it was me doing it, that'd be horrendous. But just because it's a far left winger who loved the Soviet Union, it's brilliant.
I haven't said anything about Putin.
Well, of course you've said that. You'd have not condemned Vladimir Putin's actions in Ukraine.
Okay, what actions are you talking about?
In answer to your question.
Just to finish on
in answer to your question.
Supporting the ethnic Russian resistance against fascism is perfectly valid. Russia should do more of it.
It's support for Vladimir Putin, Soviet Union. You've exposed yourself. Congratulations.
Final point, Andre.
Yeah, final point is this. It's a dog's breakfast foreign policy. But of course, we've got to say one thing very quickly. We've all got to vote for parties that want to leave the European Union.
We've got to support parties who have not been implicated
Love Vladimir Putin.
Not been implicated in war.
Love Vladimir Putin.
Okay, all right. Let's go. Let's talk about Russia specifically. I know we just kind of alluded to that, but look, I mean, Andre, you say that ultimately it was. I mean, they had to respond, surely. Well, it was a elected government, and it was a coup against that government.
You've got to bear in mind.
It's Russia's backyard. Surely they have to respond.
So I've heard this, and you've got to bear in mind. I'm on the right of the Conservatives when I work for the Conservative Party, and now we are a kind of Conservative UKIP. Publication at Breitbart. Look, Nigel Farage says the following thing, that the European Union has parked its tanks on Russia's front lawn. Ukraine is not Russia. Right, and no matter how much Vladimir Putin and the Kremlin do not accept that, that is nonetheless the case. And the problem that you've got in Kiev is very simply this. They don't like the European Union. They don't want to be taken into a federal superstate, but they'd have anything rather than Moscow, which puts them in an impossibly difficult situation.
Well, the west of the country, not the east of the country, surely.
I mean, I think it's difficult because, of course, Sebastopol and places like that have always been very heavily Russian anyway. But ultimately, Vladimir Putin's aim is to exert a huge amount of influence over these countries which wish to be independent. And no matter how much some people wish the Soviet Union still existed, it doesn't. And therefore, the Kremlin doesn't.
Dan, I'll let you come back on that very quickly.
Yanukovych was an independent leader. He wasn't pro-Putin. The crime from the point of view of the EU, who supported a coup against him, was precisely that. He was independent.
Yep. I think it's fair to say that almost nobody in Kiev agrees with that at all, but nonetheless.
All right, so let's wrap up now, guys. So looking forward to the future, who's going to win, and what are the implications going to be for British foreign policy?
I think it's very clear now that the goody and baddie idea that the American State Department had, that everybody's going to suddenly rise up against dictators and implement liberal democracy, I think is dead. We've accepted that's not going to happen. But I do think there is a great opportunity to improve, particularly the Islamic world and the Middle East, and I think that isn't necessarily involved in conflict or. But there can be negotiations that take place, and there can be assistance for people and greater free trade, which always rolls out freedom.
But less intervention.
I don't think we should commit to either more intervention or less intervention.
Okay.
We should take it on a case-by-case basis.
All right, we've got about 30 seconds left, Dan, so final word to you.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that the way the Middle East and North Africa go, I think we're going to see more of the same from the British government, which is supporting sectarian militias to achieve their goals of destabilization. And also, it's the way I see it, there's a kind of protection racket that's going on, in as much as Britain is, and France and US are sowing the seeds of terrorism through their interventions, destabilizing countries like Nigeria that had been moving closer to China, and thus propping up a new kind of military dependence where Nigeria is forced to then call on the support of Britain and US against the very threats that Britain and US created.
Okay, thanks, guys. I know we could have talked for a lot longer and argued for a lot longer. It was getting very heated at some point, but let's call a halt to it. Thank you very much. It was a lot of fun. Okay, that's all we got time for today. I hope we've been able to shed some light on Britain's foreign policy priorities and how they're playing out at this year's election. Join us again next week for more features and analysis that you won't see in the mainstream media in the run-up to the British general election on May the 7th. Bye-bye.